Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
It is clear that however brutal the condition of slaves in North America may have been, it was far better than the life experienced by slaves in the Caribbean islands or South America. In the sugar plantations and mines of the West Indies and Brazil, slaves labored under such brutal conditions that they died early, even relative to slaves elsewhere, and had to be replaced by new arrivals. The threat of being sold to a sugar plantation in the West Indies was used by North American planters to spur slaves into working harder. In North America, with the exception of the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia, the work was hard, but not so grueling as to prevent slaves from having some kind of life outside of their work. Roughly speaking, there were 3 different systems of slavery in the American colonies. First, there were the Chesapeake colonies. In Virginia and Maryland, slaves primarily worked on tobacco plantations and large farms where they raised corn, wheat, and other grains. Smaller numbers also worked in other industries, such as shipbuilding, ironworking, or in tobacco factories. Things were different in South Carolina and Georgia. In these states, slaves worked on larger rice plantations where they also raised indigo. The lives of slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia had distinct differences from those on the tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland. The rice plantations, which required more strenuous physical labor, had fewer females and therefore fewer births. Whereas Virginia's slave population was able to reproduce naturally through the births of new slaves, the rice planters maintained their labor force by importing more Africans. One result of this was that the slaves maintained a stronger tie to their African culture. A third system of slavery was found in the northern colonies. In the North, there were far fewer slaves in general, and they worked in different industries. Because the northern climate did not suit a staple crop for export, there was much less incentive for using slave labor. Although there were a few larger estates with 50 or more slaves, most slave owners owned only a few slaves who helped work the farm, or they performed as household servants. However, despite the sense of outrage displayed by the North in later years, northern colonies did in fact have slaves. Massachusetts was actually the first colony to legalize slavery. Though in many ways life was better for slaves in the North, simply by virtue of not being one of a gang of slaves driven to work on a large plantation, there were aspects of life that were worse. For one, the colder climate of the northern colonies was very different from what they knew in Africa, enhancing the alien nature of the world in which they were enslaved. Also, in the South, slavery had taken on a paternalistic attitude that, though obviously degrading, at least meant that slave owners felt a certain sense of responsibility for the rare slave who lived to an old age. In the northern colonies, slave owners would often turn older slaves out, freeing them to fend for themselves. The northern colonies were also the center of the entire North American slave trade. In particular, Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island controlled much of the importation of African slaves into the colonies, and later, the United States. Typically, they would send slaves who arrived directly from Africa to the South, keeping for themselves the slaves from the West Indies who were more likely to speak some English, French, or Spanish, and had already been broken into slavery. Slaves were individual human beings, and as such, their experience varied greatly, both within and across these different systems. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project, a part of the Works Progress Administration, gathered over 2,000 first-hand accounts of the slavery era from former slaves who were at that point elderly men and women. You will get to hear their words as they tell you their piece of American history. All of these individuals were enslaved during the final decades of American slavery, and their experiences may have been somewhat different from those enslaved during the colonial years. But they are the best eyewitnesses to the lives of American slaves. Some of them tell tales of heartbreaking sorrow and gut-wrenching violence. It may surprise most that some of the slaves remembered their masters fondly and spoke of masters who refused to allow any of their slaves to be whipped. These were people as real as you and I, and their experiences were as wildly different as those of any large group of people living across the United States over a long period of time. On plantations, cultivating the crop each season was, of course, the primary task. Beyond that, slaves would be expected to perform any of a number of menial tasks that were essential to running a plantation. This would include clearing land, building and mending fences, caring for livestock, and more. Some slaves might have specialized skills like carpentry. Others would perform any task required by the master. On larger plantations, life as a field slave might certainly be harsher. If a planter owned enough slaves, he might hire an overseer to monitor their work and push them to work even harder. Sometimes a slave might be given this position, though it would likely make him hated by his fellows. Also, on larger plantations, some slaves would work entirely as household servants. This would offer perks to the slave, but would also mean even less control over some basic personal decisions, such as requiring them to straighten their hair. But, without question, household slaves were better treated than field slaves. They were given charge of the children and preparing food, and in some cases were seen almost as an extended part of the planter's family. This brings up an important point about the condition of slavery. In many cases, the slaves suffered brutal hardships and violent treatment, but sometimes slaves were treated well and required to work no harder than the master himself. While it would obviously be preferable to be treated humanely, the great crime of slavery is that a slave was a mere possession of his master. He might have work assignments that were rewarding, and he might feel genuine affection for his master, an affection that could well be mutual. But the simple fact is that the slave could not choose to walk away from his home or employer. Even a kind master could die, and the slave would pass to his heirs just like a horse or a plot of land. And if those heirs were sadistic, or if they chose to sell him to one new owner and his wife and children to another, the slave had no recourse whatsoever under the law. On plantations such as George Washington's Mount Vernon, slaves were generally well treated, and there is evidence that Washington was not unusual in his treatment of slaves. Washington required his overseers to ensure that every laborer do as much in the 24 hours as their strength, without endangering the health or constitution, will allow.
The sun never caught him in bed, and he was unwilling to find any of his people sleeping.
Rules did vary from one plantation to the next, but commonly, slaves worked 6 days a week, having Sundays as a day of rest and religion. Monday through Saturday, they would work from dawn to dusk on the various tasks necessary to running the plantation. Generally, slaves were expected to rise at first light and head to their work site. They would have about an hour-long mid-morning halt for breakfast and another hour break in the mid-afternoon to eat. Each plantation would have rules for their slaves, and they would vary according to the master's whims. Former slave Reverend W.B. Allen explained the rules on the plantation where he worked.
Plantation rules forbid a slave to own a firearm, leave home without a pass, sell or buy anything without his master's consent, marry without his owner's consent, have a light in his cabin after a certain hour at night, attend any secret meeting, harbor or in any manner assist a runaway slave, abuse a farm animal, mistreat a member of the master's family, and do a great many other things.
On the tobacco plantations, slaves tended to live in strong family environments. The slaves reproduced with each other naturally, providing their owners with new generations of enslaved labor. The planters understood that allowing the slaves to develop a family environment gave the planters an additional means of control. The threat to break up families could prevent uprisings and any general disobedience. Slaves were less likely to participate in or encourage talk of resistance if they feared that a failed rebellion would result in their children being sold away. Marriage could also tie slaves more strongly to a plantation, making them less likely to try to run away. This is not to say that all planters would dismiss considerations of family in their decision-making, at least not at this point in history. Responsible masters would try to avoid breaking up families by selling spouses or children. About 2/3 of Washington's adult slaves were married, and he mentioned in letters his wishes that family members not be permanently separated. But many slave owners were not so scrupulous, and even the most responsible slave owner would not live forever, and his slaves would pass to his heirs. As many as 1/4 of all slave marriages were broken up by masters selling or moving one spouse. How exactly did slaves go about entering into a marriage? As always, the rules could vary from one slave owner to another. Some might try to control marriages and divorces, going so far as to tell some male slaves to take their pick among the females, and then announcing that the couple were henceforth married. A common custom was jumping the broom. Former slave Elizabeth Sparks described her wedding.
I went with Jeannie Ann and worked at house. I didn't have to cook. I got permission to get married. Yes, always had to get permission. White folks give you away. They jump across a broomstick together and you was married. My husband lived on another plantation. I slept in my mistress's room, but I ain't slept in any bed. No, sir. I slept on a carpet, an old rug before the fireplace.
The broom jumping ritual could vary from one plantation to another, but essentially, The man and woman would place separate brooms on the floor in front of each other. The couple would then step across the brooms at the same time and take each other's hands. By this ceremony, slave bride and groom affirmed their commitment to each other before the slave community. Often, as with Elizabeth Sparks, marriages occurred between slaves on different plantations. This would require the permission of both slave owners. These married couples would live separately, getting together on Saturday night to enjoy their Sunday day of rest together. In many cases, they would also have religious holidays off and could be together then as well. Though, of course, that always depended upon the goodwill of the masters.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.